This talk is called Paradigms, and you might think we've had quite enough of paradigms yesterday. The reason that I chose, in writing that introduction to the 50th anniversary edition, that 30% of the introduction would be on the section called Paradigms, partly because of what Kuhn said, that it is the particular bit of paradigm, a shared example, is the most novel and least understood aspect of the book. Paradigm as example is what René Daston spoke about yesterday, and it's what I'm going to speak about today. Paradigm, I'll call it for short, because I don't like disciplinary matrix, as community is what Norton spoke about, and I'm not going to speak about that very much. These two speakers have very much set me up for this talk. Kuhn himself said that there's, really two kinds of things that I had in mind. There's what I call local and what he called global, and the global came out to be paradigms as the constellation of a group commitments, the disciplinary matrix, and paradigms as shared examples or exemplars. Now, Norton said there are three elements to the disciplinary matrix. Actually, what Kuhn says is the fourth element is the paradigm as shared exemplar. That's just simply a quotation. I don't mean to criticize him. It's that he was interested in the first three, whereas I'm interested in the fourth. Now, this talk is only incidentally about Kuhn. I am concerned with paradigms as exemplars, and I'm really interested in what I'm going to do this sort of in a very much enlargement of the discussion of paradigms, to embed it in a kind of history of reasoning. I'm not doing history, and I'm not doing philosophy of science. I think of myself as just doing philosophy, and if you like, it's sort of a bit of the history of Western thinkings about arguments, starting with Aristotle's paradigma in the Rhetoric. In writing the introduction, I realized I ought to look at where paradigms come from. I always spend more attention on words than most people do. And this led me to read the Rhetoric for the first time, which is where the word paradigm comes in. It's translated into Latin as exemplum, into English as example in standard translations of Aristotle's Rhetoric, and the original is this Greek word there. Now, all these concepts, analogies, paradigms, resemblances, models, are a big problem for those of us schooled in deductive logic, because they don't work by rules. There's a wonderful paper by a professor in a speech and rhetoric department with the title, "Where There Are No Rules or Systems to Guide Us. The Argument from Example Rhetoric." I don't quite know what hermeneutic, I'm a little cautious about that word. There are people who discuss Aristotle's Rhetoric divide absolutely in two. One is the historians of ancient philosophy, appropriate, Aristotle, Rhetoric, etc. And the other are the people who do rhetoric and speech. And never the twain shall meet, it seems sometimes. When I was searching around, I found this paper of Arthos, whom I'd never heard of, and whom I then wrote to and so on. But I also wrote, for instance, my model of excellent scholarship on the Rhetoric is Miles Burnyeat. Miles had never heard of this. Geoffrey Lloyd, who started his career writing really about the Rhetoric and is continuing to do that to this day, had never heard of this paper or this man. Whereas I think it's actually the best essay in very recent times, in this decade, on Aristotle's Rhetoric. Now, of course, it's a main point of Miss Masterman. I call her Miss Masterman because I used to call her Miss Masterman because that was what she was called. Famous paper delineating the famous 21 different ways, which really break down to 3 different clusters. They said what it all comes down to is we need an explication of argument by analogy, which is, I think, correct. But that's partly because we have all these different words which are really hovering around the same space. Now, Kuhn himself had three proposals of how to use paradigms. They're very different. One is learning how to solve problems at the end of the chapters, which always struck me as being a very, very important observation. You don't learn by mastering the textbook. You learn by problem sets. It doesn't, in different education systems, it doesn't have to be the end of the chapters, but it has to be problem sets or something similar like that. And then he has the historical example, going from the inclined plane through the pendulum, through water spouting out of a little hole, each one building up on the ideas of the other. Very analogous to the kind of discussion one finds in Mary Hesse's book, Models and Analogies. She had only just, she was a great fan of Kuhn and also of the Strong program, interestingly, and wrote about Kuhn a lot and about the Strong program a lot later. But right at the beginning, she was again fascinated by what she called models and analogies, and she has a number of examples which are curiously analogous and in much greater detail than Kuhn's. And then the discussion ends with, this is in the second thoughts, with the example of Johnny learning how to use the words duck, goose, etc., which is a bit analogous, just another thing, to what the so-called left Wittgensteinians, Bloor, Barnes, Collins, and so on, did, which is very little connected to their sociology of knowledge. I mean, Bloor really began it with his work on Wittgenstein, and it's a curious tradition which completely ignores what Wittgenstein thought it important to begin with, namely his extraordinary critique of ostensive learning on the simple model which Kuhn and Bloor both use. Now, I think of Kuhn's three proposals as more like groping, kind of. There's nothing very, I mean, just what Rene said, you don't really you come through his attempts at explication and you don't feel you've got very far. So we've got problem sets, we've got successive solutions after Galileo, and we've got Johnny, and they don't seem to have very much to do with each other. He explicitly says, Kuhn explicitly says, that Johnny is a simplification of what happens in the little progress from Galileo to Daniel Bernoulli. What is true is that they work around something we don't well understand, and for which we use all those words, which I've listed there. Aristotle provides the first texts in which we see clear awareness of the confusions that plagued him early on. And that is why I'm doing something, sort of enlarging the panorama for a moment of people getting confused, of whom Kuhn is surely one. I mean, René Daston rightly complained that nobody's ever succeeded. And I'm arguing for a big picture that the problems are visible as early as Aristotle, and also Aristotle invented deductive logic. He invented the syllogism after he had written the rhetoric, or after he had delivered the lectures, which are the rhetoric and the topics. So, you know, that's a little complicated. If there are serious Aristotle scholars here, hands should go up. Because first of all, these texts, we don't have whatever Aristotle originally said, and he's been modified and modified and modified. We don't even have a clear, deep textual evidence that these books were written first, but I'm reporting what might be called a consensus, and as you know, every consensus in classics has as it were, anti-consensus. It's a out of nature illustration of some facts about physics. What I'm talking about is what I'm going to call the paradigmatic muddle. When I spell it with an E to make, as I say at the end, if I called it paradigmatic without that Greek E in there, I would sort of imply that it was a paradigm of a muddle or something. I sort of think it is, but I don't want to commit myself to that. But I just think that there are these notions, and analogy, resemblance, induction, signs, models, paradigms, and so on, which thinkers about thinking, thinkers about reasoning have hovered over forever and are in a kind of permanent state, hovered over forever at least from the time of Aristotle, and have been in a state of muddle ever since. Now here's Aristotle. Paradigma comes in the rhetoric. It's exemplum in Latin. In English translations, it's example, although a few use exemplar, which seems to me better, and which, of course, is Kuhn's own choice of replacement for paradigm. First lectures are the topics, the rhetoric. They're both about argument, in the sense of trying to convince somebody else. In the case of the rhetoric, an audience. In the case of the dialectic, back and forth. Not in the sense of trying to find out the truth or settle on the best course of action. Now this is an understanding which I have partly because when I was thinking about paradigms for that introduction, I read this paper by Mercier and Sperber called Why Do Humans Reason? Arguments for an Argumentative Theory. And in a real capsule. First of all, they are evolutionary psychologists. They're cognitive scientists who fully buy into the mode of discourse of evolutionary psychology. And they think that there is an evolutionary reason why reasoning is the primary purpose, why it evolved among human beings, is for arguing with other people, trying to convince them, trying to share opinion. And they have the usual, I'm not trying to be sarcastic here, true, they have the usual just so story. You imagine a small group of people. What's important is that they should agree on what to do. Even if it's not the best thing to do, it's a better thing to do something in common than to start fighting among yourselves about what you ought to do. So this is the evolutionary explanation of why argument comes first. And it has more evolutionary advantage, etc., than being able to make correct deductions and inductive inferences. And they claim to be able to explain many of the so-called paradoxes that stem from the work of Tversky and Kahneman. That is, where it seems like people innately, quotes, reason badly. And if reasoning is for getting at the truth, this would be a great evolutionary disadvantage. But if reasoning is for getting agreement, reasoning badly needn't be a bad thing at all, so long as it convinces and persuades. I'm not going to develop that line, but I'm going to fess up to having been strongly impressed by this line of discussion at a time when I was thinking about paradigm and rhetoric. I wrote to them immediately and said, you know, this is what the rhetoric is all about. And they both said, we've never read the rhetoric. Isn't that by Aristotle or somebody? Which is, no, anyway. Now, so my proposal is, suppose they're on the right track. That argument for convincing people is a universal human universal, precedes logic, either as demonstrative reasoning, mathematical proof, or the syllogism. And before he invented the syllogism, Aristotle lectured on argument. Now, of course, it's not essential to the course of my paper that I am correct in assuming this consensus view, but it creates a good story, which is all that I'm really good at anyway. Aristotle was, in writing the rhetoric and the topics, was in rebellion, outright rebellion against his teacher. You know, the usual evil thing. Because Socrates and Plato had said, you can't teach argument. It doesn't have a subject matter. Whereas Aristotle said they do. Here is, well, just read the blacked thing there. I'll leave that up enough time for you to read the first. It is possible to observe why some succeed by habit and others accidentally. And all would agree that such observation is the activity of an art. This is absolutely contrary to Plato, Socrates, who said, you know, you can teach cookery because it's got a subject matter. You can teach medicine because it's got a subject matter. You can teach navigation because it's got a subject matter, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't teach argument because it's about anything. I mean, in fact, it has the implication you can't teach logic. You can teach mathematics because mathematics is a subject matter, or has many subject matters. And logic is about everything, and so you can't, it would actually follow you can't teach logic, but luckily at the time of Plato, logic had not been invented yet. Mathematical demonstration had, and deeply impressed Plato, and you can teach mathematical demonstration because it has a subject matter. It's about triangles and squares of those days, and conics and a lot of other things. I remind you of the bad reputation of rhetoric. These definitions: derogatory, jocular, artificial, insincere, extravagant, grandiloquent. Boy, it really gets trashed by the dictionary makers. Now, of course, there's been a movement in history and sociology of science to say, but all science is rhetoric and so on, and to pay no attention to this tradition of downing rhetoric. I don't want to down rhetoric. I think rhetoric is enormously important, but it's worth noticing what Aristotle himself says. He says, previous manuals give most of their attention external to the subject. They attack, pity, render emotions, don't relate to the fact, they just appeal to the juryman. So he's with Plato. He doesn't want to have just mere emotional appeal. He doesn't mean oratory. He means the theory of good public speaking. The function of rhetoric is not to persuade, but that's rhetoric in the sense of what he's doing, is not to persuade, but to see the available means of persuasion. In other words, it's a kind of meta-persuasion. It's a study of what persuades. And Kennedy, the greatest expert on that text and its later manifestations throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, continues in the same spirit. Now, there's a huge difference between rhetoric and dialectic, which is that rhetoric is for talking to people and convincing people. And it has to start in having an argument, long arguments, despite what I say, if this is one long argument today for 45 minutes or something, it's not good rhetoric, because you want the arguments to be short, pithy, not such that people can get their heads around them. Have to be brief, the need for brevity. Dialectic, back and forth, two parties. But notice that both are spoken. I think it's important that when we're looking at these ancient texts, we're in a culture, of course it's literate for a small number of people, but it's still, a base is still very strongly close to an oral culture, and most people don't read or write. Most people can recite Homer. Translators tend to try to make Homer less boring by making him less repetitive than he is. But in fact, all those things go through repeat. The stanza, just like, as Reveal-Netz points out, early geometry did. It's incredibly repetitive. And that's because they're really still working with an oral culture. Aristotle is one of many at the cusp in that. Sophocles isn't writing a play. He's composing words which people remember for a play. And Aristotle's transition from rhetoric to the analytics is partly a cementing of the transition. Now, Aristotle says that there are only two rhetorical forms of argument: enthymeme and rhetoric. There is an enormous literature on enthymemes, hardly any on paradigms. And the standard views about both, I says, not on my own strength, is that they're wrong. On enthymemes, I'm not even going to discuss it. The standard view is that, and you will have seen this in elementary logic textbooks, an enthymeme is simply a syllogism with a premise omitted. And Bernier is totally, and others, but Miles above all, totally convincing that's false to me, convincing to me that it's false. And the standard view about paradigms is that paradigms in rhetoric correspond to induction in dialectic. And Aristotle does say so, but it all has to do, in my opinion, with the paradigmatic muddle, which Aristotle is trying to work his way out. So I've got the standard view up here. Paradigm is an instance that lends itself to a universal generalization. Aristotle says that. Induction in dialectic is induction by simple enumeration. Need for brevity in rhetoric forces us to skip the enumeration, give just one or two examples. Arthos calls this, Arthos of the no rules or systems to guide us, calls this the inductive formulation. And he who has spent his life studying argument textbooks, that's what he does for a living, says he can find no exception to the inductive formulation. That astonishes me, but I'm just taking this as what somebody who's read all the books says. And he says it can't possibly be right. Paradigms are examples all the way. They're not closely connected with induction, even though Aristotle says so. And, well, what's induction? Many people take by epigoge to mean induction by simple enumeration. You know, Mill is beautiful. Tom, Dick, and Harry were mortal, so the Duke of Wellington is mortal. This is, of course, a much more impressive statement, inference, at Mill's time. Mill, the great liberal, the Duke of Wellington was the most reactionary, successful politician in Great Britain at the time, and Mill was hoping he'd die sometime. So this is really an important inference. And then the general one to the genus. It's clear that Aristotle thinks of finding a genus under which all the instances fall, but I don't think he ever sorted this out. The reason is that there's so much disagreement about Aristotle. It's just that. He says in the Topics, contrary to what he has said, he says you should use arguments by likeness. It resembles induction. It's like induction, but it's not the same thing. In induction, the universal, that is mortal, is secured, whereas in likeness, we get is particulars like Tom, Dick, and Harry. And so he thinks there's two different kinds of arguments. So now we've got arguments by likenesses which don't demand universals, which is very important. This is one minor evidence of muddle all over the place, and I could iterate and iterate. Arthos says which Aristotle, and he suggests that Aristotle had two views, never disentangled. One is induction by enumeration, abbreviated need for brevity. The other, in which example is a major form of argument. And Arthos thinks the second one is what's important and why he says paradigms are exemplars all the way down. And he finds correctly a more thorough understanding and use of example in Roman than in late Hellenistic authors. So I've now got three examples. Actually, two or three of them are used in the introduction to the Kuhn 50th anniversary. I'll just take the first one. You know, should, because it's pretty relevant. Should Athens go to war with its neighbor? No. It was evil of that neighbor to make war on its neighbor Phocas. So it would be evil for us to make war on Thebes. And then we have another one, Xerxes. Kind of a nice geopolitical thing. I mean, what should we do? Remember that corner of the Mediterranean, there are three world powers. There's the Greek city-states, which sometimes get together as a world power. There's Egypt and there's Persia, and we've got to do the balancing of power network, which is commonly attributed to British diplomacy in the Great Age of Europe, but that's actually what Greece did, and this is the argument for it, in the Great Age of Greece. And then there's another one where he actually lists more, which is more like an inductive one. I've listed all of those. Aristotle also says, interestingly, that you have to use familiar examples, which can be of two kinds. They can be history, and they can be fables. Now, of course, we're all brought up to mean you couldn't possibly begin a sound argument with a fiction, something fabulous. Whereas for Aristotle, what's important is that there's a fable on which everybody knows and which exemplifies some truth, even if the fable is itself a fiction. And he mentions all sorts of things. Herodotus, he says, the Herodotus, or people say Herodotus' histories really are a combination of histories and tales and fables and so on, and all can be evoked in a rhetorical argument. They're suitable, and here is why. I won't go on about that, but They should be made in the same way as comparisons, so one can see the likeness, which is rather easy from philosophical studies. And I think of Ludwig Wittgenstein and John Wisdom, who was a professor at Cambridge University when I began. The important thing is the audience should be well stocked. And so there's formulae that are used. One remembers Yeats on the art of memory. This is all basically pre-literate world, and certainly pre-printing world. And I won't develop the Bacon theme, but Bacon is absolutely wonderfully full of arguments by example. So that is, the essays are just example after example of historical incidents, usually classical incidents, which every person in his audience will understand. Even though for us, even though for me, being ignorant, I have to go look them up. And I've just left that there. So the muddle is, I think, illustrated by the disagreement about how to read Aristotle's rhetoric and dialectics. I think it's because the classical interpreter wants to find a clear thought in the clear author, and Aristotle is the model of clear reasoning. I think Aristotle is just confused, and we are still. So you're not going to find a coherent theory in Aristotle any more than you're going to find a coherent theory in Kuhn. This confusion continues forever and ever. After the rhetoric, he invents the syllogism. These are different. They're formal. They depend on the form of premises and conclusions. You can notice them in speech, especially if you've got formulae, but much more easily perceived when written down. They're really something which want writing. Logic needs writing. Deductive logic needs writing. In the beginning, you could do mathematics without writing, as Netz observes, because there are formulaic turns of speech which move the proof along. So you don't need to be able to write because you can remember the formulae. Not formulae in that sense, but formulaic in the sense that it's repetitive over and over again. And something has happened. Around this time, we've got certainty from two sources. One is from the discovery of demonstrative proofs, which is esoteric, and the other, which is completely exoteric. The syllogism is truth-preserving, and everybody can understand a syllogism. Or rather, if you don't understand a syllogism, you're not worth paying attention to. I mean, remember Vygotsky going to the pre-literate people in Siberia, and he asked them these syllogistic questions. And now he's very respectful, but many of his readers were not very respectful. He explains why the natives there don't reason syllogistically, don't acknowledge reasoning syllogistically. Those very same people entering grade school here, they're going to be put in the Dumbo class. They're going to be put in special learning. You're out if you can't do a syllogism. So it's an admission ticket as much as, it's not so much it's a proof of understanding as an admission ticket to being among the understanding. And then Stoics, especially Bernier thesis, kick out rhetoric. Bernier says that the Stoics pretty well killed off the study of non-deductive chains of argument. And Arthos says something we're parallel and similar. Example did flourish in Rome and in the Renaissance. And the early monarchs finally dumped it. But remember, even that Bacon's prerogative instances are, I think, paradigms or exemplars. Montaigne, however, expresses, he has just one sentence isolated, saying, the example is worthless. End of discussion. I was led partly to this because I was asked to go to a conference in last summer called The Crisis of Exemplarity, which was all about the collapse of the use of the example in the late Renaissance and the beginning of early modern. And of course, why was I invited when I don't know anything about the Renaissance and early modern? Well, because the thought was the crisis of exemplarity was followed by the emergence of probability. That's a great compliment, but I don't think it's true. But anyway, I did read the texts that were circulated, that is Renaissance texts in translation which were circulated, and they were marvelous examples of people being very worried about examples. Actually, I would say as evincing the muddle about modularity. Now, Something else happens after the early modern, or in the early modern. We have the coming into being of inductive logic. Hume invents the skeptical problem. Jacques Bernoulli invents one kind of inductive logic. Thomas Bayes invents another. And logic, deductive or inductive, provides rules or systems to guide us. I repeat Arthos's title phrase. And they have no place for paradigms. Of course, this history, I have to say, Pache Dan Garber, who demolished it long ago, but we'll leave that. A couple of examples of people who do like examples. Here is Gadamer, who is actually quoted in Arthos. Emphasis on unique and historical concreteness. Notice that all of Aristotle's examples in the rhetoric were unique and historically concrete. Toulmin, again, the same sort of thesis. For addressing an audience, but I want to say, for addressing an audience, what counts also is vividness, which is not stated by Aristotle, but all his examples are vivid for the audience which he's concerned with. I won't develop this cloth of Aris, but you can in discussion if you like, which is in the essay on friendship by Bacon, and which Judith Baker here drew my attention to. It seems to be a perfect example. A shorter one is John Wisdom, who is very keen on particular case arguments, and he gives us a very short example. The lady, we're talking in England quite some decades ago, the lady who comes to her friend with a new Easter bonnet, very elaborate Easter bonnet. And the friend gives one look and says, "My dear, the Taj Mahal." There are no rules or systems to guide us. We do learn by example. In the common law, apprentice lawyers, tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is the phrase that Kuhn picked up from Polanyi, as you recall. Most apprenticeships, welding, repairing computers, microbiology, is learning from examples, carrying on in the same way. Usual problems about the same. Incidentally, the regress argument, which people speak about as the rule-following considerations, is a vastly important, deep generalization of the regress argument in Quine, which recalls Lewis Carroll in 1895. No one ever looks around the 1895 paper by Lewis Carroll, which is full of medieval discussions of the same thing. Lewis Carroll has simply moved into a convenient late Victorian mode a bunch of medieval discussions about regresses. Now, there's a missing element, in my opinion, in Mercier and Sperber, whom I call Marx and Sparks M&S. The arguments work in a community only when they're ritualized, when there's some sort of rote procedure or routine. That's what Aristotle is presenting in the rhetoric, are the routines that work. And the advice is, take these. Now, there are a whole bunch of anecdotal examples. My own private one is I worked in Uganda for 2 years, where my students were extremely well trained. They'd all been to mission schools. They were to be the future elite of Uganda. And but they were the first literate members of their families in almost all cases. They came from pre-literate cultures. And many of them told me about how an argument went on in their hometown, as it were. Everybody had a stock, all the important elders had a stock of about 5,000 proverbs. So if a person was accused of all the usual things people are said to be accused of, the falsely white person used example is someone stole your cow, your advocate sits down and tells a proverb about your relationship to your cow. The other advocate tells another proverb, and back and forth, and the proverbs have to be played out against each other. And this I use as an explanation of why my students, who are less good at symbolic logic than, say, students at the University of Chicago, could write much better arguments using particular cases, using examples, vivid examples. They were the best freshman students at giving examples to create an argument, bolster an argument, I said, but create an argument that I've ever had. because I think they came from a different thing. I mention also in early geometry, thanks to nets, the importance of the formulaic prose around the diagrams. Now, the culmination of rote is a rule. You can see the syllogism as the final ritualization of a rule everyone knows. Same with Bernoulli. But you can't really produce a set of rules for the proverbs. Maybe you can think of Euclidean postulates as rules for ritualizing geometrical reasoning. But rules are not justifications, they're codifications. I mean, that's part of the Wittgenstein point. You know, in the case of the riveter, she has to acquire a routine, but it also has to acquire skills for dealing with unexpected events. And there are safety manuals for riveters or contemporary, more recent technologies, but they're guidelines mostly to guard against tort cases when things go wrong. The diagrams of the Greeks are tools to help one see and have a role similar to that of the formulaic character. Now, rotes and routines are communal. Finally, we get back to communities. Of course, each of us has our own little routines in the morning and so forth and so on. But it takes two to argue, and it takes a community for there to be an oration. As argument becomes ritualized for any audience, it becomes possible to suggest guidelines about how to argue. That's what Aristotle was doing in the rhetoric, capturing classes of exemplars, always historical or fabulous, that work in the agora. Aristotle did a valiant job of getting out of the paradigmatic muddle in a narrow range of human activity and experience. Kuhn did a valiant job, but he was concerned with a prodigious range of human experience. And in a funny way, a historian though he is, you know, reintroducing history into the study of science, he treated science as a sort of ahistorical way. He didn't attend to how the rituals of sciences change. You know, problems at the end of the chapter. That's very appropriate, actually, for the day I was put my fourth year physics course, or actually I got an A, but I mean, then I stopped doing practical physics thereafter. And I had to solve all those problems at the end of the chapter. Students don't even do problems at the end of the chapter now. And they certainly did, well, they just about began to when there was the Tate and Thompson textbook. There are equivalent problems at the end of the chapter. Certainly earlier in the sciences they weren't. But he writes as if that were a timeless social phenomenon, whereas it's an example of learning from example. And I suggest here that the sociologists of science, who, as Norton said, aver last sometime recently in Berlin, that they got it all from Kuhn, are actually trying to historicize that aspect of Kuhn which I call ahistorical. They're not doing sociology. It's not about tending to little social interactions. That's extremely interesting and important in itself as an investigation. But what they're really after is observing how the rituals that underlie paradigms change and how the rituals are different in different physics communities. And so my concluding proposal is in red, that all paradigms as example are grounded in rote and ritual peculiar to a community, and that's where the paradigm as communal comes in. Thank you very much.
Dan Garber, and then any guys.
Is the microphone or?
Oh.
I think you just speak up, Dan. You have a voice. I will do that. Thank you very much, Ian, for a really interesting talk. And I'm not sure what it is that you meant when you said, you know, refuted that you in that particular.
He and Sandy Zabel, when they were in Chicago, wrote by far and away the most interesting critique, and many have said demolition of the emergence of probability.
It wasn't intended to be a demolition.
Yeah, but that's got nothing to do with take-up.
But in any case, that's not my question. The one thing I was actually very surprised that you didn't talk about was the use of examples in legal reasoning. Because in a certain very obvious way, I thought of this when you were talking about the use of the children in Uganda and their experience. Because that's exactly, I think, what it is that often goes on in legal reasoning, is you take an unfamiliar case, and then you try in one way or another, one advocate will, the defender will try to analogize it to one kind of case, the prosecutor will try to analogize it to another kind of case. And that's a situation in which I think there may be some fairly well-developed, at least rules of thumb for what's considered appropriate and what is
I actually did have one line on there about apprentice lawyers, and I did have the phrase the common law. What you're describing is basically common law procedures, and is the Dutch Roman law does it differently, which is already an instance of the importance of the particular community. But in the common law, we do that. The reason I didn't say I mentioned John Wisdom a couple of times. Actually, all this comes from my first exposure to John Wisdom, which the first philosophy lecture I ever went to, and he was talking about particular case arguments, and he was always using precedent, common law precedent. I mean, I gave the example of the Taj Mahal, but a good lawyer can do a Taj Mahal on you. So I completely agree. Thank you. Thank you for adding a footnote, which I should have written myself.
I was so struck by your comment that if we didn't have rules as a gold standard, we wouldn't be so worried about this muddle. And I've been looking recently into the history of rules, and I wonder whether or not it's not just rules as gold standard, or a particular kind of rule. So if you go back to the Greek word canon and the Latin word regula, their earliest usage, right through the 18th century, right through the Encyclopédie, is as a model. So the definition and the Encyclopédie for règle is our Lord Jesus Christ is the rule of our life, is the model of the exemplum. It's only toward the end of the 19th century that the meaning of rule becomes primarily, the arithmetic operations of addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. So I wonder whether this isn't a kind of historical model. That is, if we had a notion of rule which could still encompass guidelines, maxims, precepts, and the like, we would not be so obsessed with the contrast between one narrow band meaning of rule, the algorithmic rule, and everything else.
Thank you very much, Rainey, and I really look forward to the results of these researches. There was a time in analytic philosophy, I think Paul Ziff may have been the one who started it, to say, we're not talking about rules, we're talking about regularities. And he was always trying to be as close as he could to John Austin, to speak in high class but absolutely precise in English. So here is someone who thinks, and I of course have the same attitude, partly because of my education, that we still can make a distinction between a regularity and a rule. But a quite different point, something which you and quite a number of other people in this room are particularly familiar with, the difficulty of doing an historical analysis of a concept, and at the same time wanting to use that concept in a slightly different tone of voice. Thus, when I am saying that the syllogism establishes, in effect, a rule of procedure, but notice I also go to routine and wrote all those big R words. I'm there using rule as one often does in the early 21st century. Although I am really welcome to the idea that the very idea of a rule changes. But in describing these past phenomena, I'm using the word in a contemporary sense. And I'm not saying that I definitely did not say and would not have wanted to say, even before your intervention, that Aristotle thought of the syllogism as a rule in his, whatever language he was thinking in. But rather that the syllogism does have the role of a rule of right reason in our present terminology. There's this boring question. as I find it, I have a suspicion that the authors of Objectivity find it a very boring question about the mix of discourses when talking about an older discourse and at the same time writing in a contemporary discourse. But I really look forward to the historical epistemology of rules.
I want to come back to a theme that I think has cut through a couple of the talks, and which is, what is a community? And so I was thinking after the discussion that in Norton's talk yesterday, I was trying to understand what, Norton, you meant when you said it's not a community, despite the fact that he uses the word community all the time. So I have a gloss on what I think you were saying and how Ian's using it, and I think there are three notions of community at stake here, and they're quite distinct. The first is, I think, well, first and third are related, and that is that when you say it's not a community, that I think what you're saying is it's not a sociological community. That is to say, it doesn't have the dynamics of a Durkheimian or other form of sociologically analyzed dynamic that behaves in a way other than a simple sharing or communal participation. So it's like sampling an uninteresting flat layer of geological strata. You can sort of punch anywhere you want, you find the same thing. And in that sense, it's communal. There's lots of people involved, but it's not sociologically dynamic it's not saying that these behaviors are symbolic of a relationship of religion is being used as a stand-in for other forms of social relations or any other dynamics that we're familiar with from the long history of sociology. Ian, I think, was using, there's a second, so there are two senses. One is, there's a way in which, Norton, you're saying there's a distinction between this kind of flat homogeneity of a community that really is just an individual multiplied. And then there's the sociological alternative to that, which you're saying he's not using, which is really a dynamical one. Ian is using it, there's another sense where there's certain arguments, and Ian presented one of them, where it doesn't make sense to have one person by themselves having an argument as such, unless you do something complicated. In this part of Wittgenstein, he actually takes an alternate character that one might argue with. I mean, but in the first instance, and on the instance on which that's modeled, an argument requires two people, and an audience requires three. That's a kind of, there's a kind of, I hesitate to use the term logical, but there's a kind of almost syntactic requirement of certain kinds of utterances or strategies or practices that require at least one, at least two, or at least three people. That also involves something like a community, and it's not either the sociodynamics of Durkheim, nor is it the flat repetition of the individual that you were invoking, Norton, when you said Kuhn is genuinely sociological. But it is a kind of syntactic logical analysis of having a first person, a second person, and a third person perspective in order to even begin to have the conditions of possibly talking about rhetoric or argument or oratory. And so I think those three different senses of community are at play in our discussions. And,
yeah, thank you, Peter. And maybe Norton would like to say something. I'd just like to slightly change or augment what you said. It's important to how I was ending that what I deliberately call ritual, just to make it a kind of slightly shock word, is important to how the arguments go. It's not, I mean, so it takes two to have rhetoric and three to have, whatever it is. It takes, whatever. I got it wrong, I can't count. But it takes a mob to have rhetoric, and it takes at least two people to have dialectic. But what Aristotle, I think, very importantly says, you've got to choose, it's not just argument by examples, You've got to choose the right examples. In a common law legal case, you've got, I strongly don't believe that there are anything more than manuals for argument by precedent. But you're certainly clear what the official allowed examples are. And that's why they have in all the TV dramas, they have all those law books at the back, because they're actually the material manifestation of the precedents. And I think what Kuhn was drawing attention to, whether he consciously thought this out or not, is that the class of examples partly determines what the community is. He was very interested in the profound anthropological question, which I really owe to Mary Douglas than to historians or philosophers, to the anthropologist. What keeps a group together? Why don't groups fall apart? And groups do fall apart. So what's the difference between a group that falls apart? And Mary Douglas had all sorts of marvelous examples of this. Different kinds of things that fall apart and stick together. And one of Kuhn's suggestions was that it was a particular set of problems or examples which binds a community together and makes the whole process work. Just as for Aristotle, a particular class of historical examples familiar to your audience. It's absolutely essential to know your audience. And that creates a kind of temporary community. They're the people to whom I can orate. Thus, to this audience, I can with fair confidence mention Mary Douglas. I can think of a number of anthropologist friends of mine whom I also have learned a great deal from, whom I could not mention in this audience without giving a long explanation of what they've done and why they interest me. That's just a little tiny bit of what makes a community out of something, are the examples which are shared and acknowledged. I mean, they may be detested, just as in the legal case or the proverb arguments. One party may say, that's a terrible precedent, what's that going to do? But still, it's sort of in the canon, whereas if I did a fable in Aristotle's work, I would be laughed out of court, literally, or maybe kicked out of court, literally. Whereas for Aristotle, and I think I haven't done enough work on this to know, and never will I. I think Bacon uses fabulous examples too. Does he? Thank you. I just didn't recall anything at the moment. So, I mean, so there, and whereas we can't use fabulous examples unless we're the Republican candidate for president.
Oh, this is marvelous. I want to try to connect the dots among several things that I've heard this morning and yesterday, starting with what George said that Kuhn said to Kuhn about the manuscript. You should look at the useful arts, or I don't remember, the practical arts. Sorry, in my mind they're synonymous, and perhaps they shouldn't be. You should look at the practical arts, and you have used examples from welding and other kinds of craft construction work and making. And I think you used the phrase this morning, rules of thumb, which was also in my mind. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you take a rule of thumb to be. Do you consider it synonymous with heuristic? And if so, what might be the role of rules of thumb or heuristics in reasoning, and in what context?
I think I'm going to pass on that and add rule of thumb and heuristic to my list of words which we use over which this muddle is hovering.
Last question.
Okay, I don't want to take up any time, just to respond quickly to Peter and also to Ian Scott, which I very much appreciate. I think what you've made perfectly clear is that to make an example exemplary, you need a community. You need the interaction. And I think Tom was very much aware of that. Unfortunately, he never provided us with an example of how that works, how it is developed in a particular case. And I think that's what I would most like to see put into structure if one were to develop it in greater